I mean, this is our functional founder over here. When we start ignoring little signs, they start becoming like orange lights. So we're not addressing it. And here's a problem. So the functional founder doesn't address the issue. And then, say, for instance, with Joe starts disengaging. And then the issue starts becoming bigger because there are more complaints on site. He's leading a team. So other people are seeing it. So it starts becoming like, you can probably use the analogy of a fruit bowl, and there's a rotten tomato in a fruit bowl. It's going to make the other tomatoes rotten. So that's when a functional founder needs to get engaged. And I didn't do that. I was waiting for my team to do that. And the problem just got a bit bigger. And then eventually the problem became so big that he started, having a side hustle.
You're listening to The Functional Founder with Themi, a podcast for owner-operators ready to build high-performance teams, handle growth with confidence, and scale without burning out.
Hey, functional founders, welcome back to another podcast where we talk about building businesses to work without us. And in today's podcast, I'm going to talk about areas that functional founders cannot systemize, areas that functional founders cannot delegate. In fact, it's about having the tough conversations. And that's the opportunity to build a great culture of winning A players and creating dominant logic in your business that others can learn from. In fact, it's so important this session that I've decided to take some notes just to stay topical. Joe's an A player that worked for us in our company. In fact, he still works for us, thank goodness. But recently, a couple of days ago, I had to have a meeting because I realized that this employee was starting to wean. He was starting to get demotivated, and he's out in the field. So he does installations for us, but he's a great A player, if I can call him that. Motivated, intentional. Okay, he used to arrive late at work at some stages throughout his employment, but really I could lean on him, or we could lean on him as a team. It was a concern for me that Joe was starting to lose motivation. And I knew to be a functional founder, and not just a founder, I needed to get hands-on very quickly. So I booked a meeting with Joe and then also my management team at 8 a.m. recently to have a discussion around what is going on with a specific A player. You know, the worst for me was that I was noticing that he was losing trust in his leadership team. He was starting to disengage and maybe even refusing tasks. And then one day he didn't appear at work. And that could be an episode of dismissal, because in our country, if you abscond from duty, you can have written warnings and eventually lead to dismissal. And I was very concerned about this. So I took that opportunity to get my leaders together, because what I was essentially doing, because this didn't just happen over a week. This has been happening over the last couple of weeks. So I'm to blame, because I realized, and I made some notes here, I realized that I was starting to go into denial, where even my team and myself, we were ignoring the cues. So in the beginning, I mean, this is our functional founder over here. When we start ignoring little signs, they start becoming like orange lights. So we're not addressing it. And here's a problem. So the functional founder doesn't address the issue. And then, say, for instance, with Joe starts disengaging. And then the issue starts becoming bigger because there are more complaints on site. He's leading a team, so other people are seeing it. So it starts becoming like, you can probably use the analogy of a fruit bowl, and there's a rotten tomato in a fruit bowl. It's going to make the other tomatoes rotten. So that's when a functional founder needs to get engaged. And I didn't do that. I was waiting for my team to do that. The problem just got a bit bigger. And then eventually the problem became so big that he started, having a side hustle. Because when I sat with Joe, I realized that the reason why he absconded is because he needed extra income. So he decided to do a side hustle. And eventually that can bite you as a functional founder, not only because you lose that employee, but you've created a culture where you're tolerating this behavior, number one, and not only behavior from Joe's side, but we're tolerating opportunities to hear our people because Joe wasn't heard. I sat Joe down and I eventually chatted about specific outcomes that we need to have for our discussion. And I spoke about the win-win scenario. And I said, Joe, in order for us to have a good outcome in this meeting, and remember, I had my management team sitting there as well. So, Joe, in order for us to have a good outcome, can we focus on a win-win scenario? So Joe looked at me very confused, and I made the assumption that he knew what a win-win was, but he didn't know because when I asked him, do you understand what a win-win would be? He says, no, can you please explain that? So I said, well, Joe, it would be that the outcome would be favorable for you and the outcome of this discussion will also be favorable for us. That's what we're going to try and aim for. Is that okay? And I kept quiet. Joe thought about it and he says, yes, absolutely, that's okay. And then I said, well, there are other scenarios too. There could be a lose-win scenario, which is, we walk out in this meeting where we're losing out and you scoring because you've got all the benefits, higher income, etc. And we're losing because we can't afford to pay an extra staff member. And this has ramifications on the rest of the team. If we just up your salary without explaining the process, then we could have ramifications on cash flow. And that could have implications on the farmer. Remember, it can bite you eventually. So we're addressing it. And then the other outcome would be if we walk out of this meeting and you are losing out and we are winning. In other words, we're not prepared to come to the party in any way, and you just carry on working, and then eventually you get more upset and more disgruntled. And that wouldn't be a favorable outcome because, we're paying you and you're doing all this work and we're not hearing you. So that would be a lose scenario. Do you understand that? He says, absolutely. So I said, but there is another scenario. And I think this is clear for functional founders because they don't often go here. And it's very important, I believe, that we address this, is that we work on, if we can't find a win-win situation, that we focus on a lose-lose, which means this conversation might in a situation where both of us lose. In other words, we propose something because we're coming to the party and we're showing that we're listening. You're not prepared to take it on board. And for some reason, you will feel that you're not heard and you will leave. We will feel like, this person's inflexible and not understanding the situation we're going through as well. And therefore we lose. We lose a good employee and you lose an opportunity to work with one of the greatest installation companies, I believe, in South Africa. And he understood that. So lose-lose is also on the table. And it is a possible outcome. And so, Joe, do you understand that? And he understood that. So reframing that process is absolutely crucial. And I believe it's so important in discussing it with the team, not only for Joe, but also for my leaders. Because you see, functional founders need to get involved. They need to roll up their sleeves and find opportunities to coach their team because I believe in dominant logic. And if we can train our leaders to think the way we do, it will eventually filter down where they will have these conversations without us. But we've also got to be very clear that if we're going to grow the culture of the company, values are put on the wall for people to see, but you've got to live them and you've got to create opportunities for yourself for you to teach and re-engage the values in such a way that the dominant logic starts filtering through like a funnel, starts filtering through to the rest of your team so that they can take it up with their people. So the outcome was quite interesting. So I said to Joe, okay, Joe, now that we understand we're working towards either a win-win or a lose-lose, and that a win-lose or a lose-win is off the table, then let's proceed. And I gave him the platform to talk. So I called the one-on-one meeting and I gave him the plus, said, what's happening? And the outcome was quite astonishing. Just sitting quietly, engaging with him in an authentic manner, looking him in the eyes and saying, Joe, what's happening? You've been one of the best workers that we've had. Can you unpack and explain where we could have gone wrong? So he said, well, yes, I can. I'm a father. I'm a new father. I've got a 2-year-old. There's nursery schools and expenses have just gone up through the roof. I'm not single anymore. I'm married as well. I've got to buy nappies. There's food. There's doctors. And I find I'm not coming out. It was at that stage when I thought to myself, okay, first of all, I hear you. And second of all, Joe, let us try and come up with a solution together where you can win and we can win. So one of the solutions was obviously to raise the pay. So I said, okay, so what would be your objective? And he mentioned the salary. And I thought about it. I thought, is this person worth the salary increase? And I believe yes, because in order to keep good people, I believe you do need to pay them more than the standard. At least make an attempt as you're growing. It's not always possible, and founders struggle with that in the beginning. I think coaching hundreds of founders all over the world, running businesses is very difficult because you want those A players or those good people to work for you, but you simply can't afford them. So when you do find one, you've got to cherish it. You've got to look after this person. So I thought, okay, here's the opportunity for a win-win. What happens, Joe, if we can meet your expectations? Not altogether, but 70%. How would that work? He says, well, that's much better than it was. I said, yes, and you would be the most highly paid person in our workforce. How would that work out for you? He said, absolutely. I said, Joe, there is the other side of it. Yes, you are going to win through this process, but we want to win too. Joe, one of the reasons why you're not being paid where you are is because you don't have a driver's license. So it costs us money to have to take you out to site the whole time. It's an extra employee with a car license that's to drop you on site. And we've appealed to you many times to go for your car license. So would that be something that you'd be able to take on as part of this win-win? So he looked at me and said, yes, he will take it on. The second thing is, Joe, the side hustles must stop. We cannot afford to explain. You see, the thing is with having a founder present in a conversation like that is that founders have the ability to give more context. And I believe sometimes management don't, because 69% of management, they don't address the tough conversations and they don't unpack it in layman terms, because I believe you can never over communicate. Asking the question, Joe, do you understand why we are saying you can't have a side hustle? He says, well, no, because then you're going to lose out on work for that day. I said, no, Joe, that's not the reason. That's part of the reason. But the other reason, Joe, if I can explain, is that you are setting the example. So if other people see you do a side hustle, then the rest of the team can do side hustles. Would that be fair? And I left it with Joe. And Joe said to me, no, that wouldn't be fair. So do you understand that a person with your position and your abilities and your leadership qualities, you need to be a leader and train other leaders. You cannot train other leaders when you're breaking those rules in the business. Do you understand that? And he said, absolutely understands. So side hustles will stop. Joe quite understood that. He understood. I said, okay, let's summarize the meeting. We prepared to come to the party to a certain extent, which was almost double his salary. And then he was prepared to come to the party by offering his driver's license and not doing the side hustle. So the first part of this whole process is for a founder to take charge, roll up the sleeves and make that appointment, book it in the diary and take the opportunity to include the rest of the management, because you're having that dominant logic filter through your team, which I find quite crucial. The second point is to frame the conversation on what the outcome would be. I like to frame it as the win-win philosophy. And the third element would be writing it down, the discussion, capturing it on paper. Because in all honesty, we all know what happens. Words can be used against people and time goes by and we forget what we have said. And there are apps out there that can take minutes and write it down. But I just believe we'll record the conversation on an app. That's fine. We'll have minutes. But having just a one pager where we can just say, okay, so let's summarize. This is your new salary. This is where the outcome of the win-win that we require to stop the side hustle and we require you to have your driver's license. And it was signed on paper, so it's sealed and it would go into his file. And if ever the conversation arises again, not for purposes of dismissal and warning letters, etc. For the purposes of clearer, better communication and understanding, is that we can whip out this letter and discuss it. There was one element that I also brought up with Joe, was that our values need to be lived. And one of the values was broken because he used another example in our discussion. And don't get me wrong, he's a good worker, but obviously when people don't get heard, they can get sidetracked. And with this specific member, with Joe, employee, he decided to, while he was disgruntled and feeling disconnected to the rest of the team, someone asked him to do something and he declined a leader's request to do something that everyone else was doing. He made an excuse. He says, I'm busy packing my vehicle at the moment. And he publicly did that. And in our value system, that's the beautiful thing about having values. I took Joe to the board again and I said, Joe, remember, when we communicate with different people of our workforce, we don't have a spat with them in public. We call them face to face. We have a meeting. So if you did have an issue about packing your vehicle, please, I'm going to request that we follow the value system. And by the way, that was also included in the letter and signed, that we will live our value system. So, Joe, do you understand that we have to live our value system because leadership is important in this company? And Joe understood that very clearly. So just in summary, again, about the reframing of the win-win, decided to make a quick note just so that we can have a better understanding of it. And I believe in teaching my team this all the time, is that we we don't want to focus on a win-lose. We don't want to focus on a lose-win. We don't ideally want a lose-lose situation. Ideally, we want a win-win. But these are the two areas that can be possible outcomes. You see, you're not only being blindly optimistic, but you're also being the win-win, but you're also being realistic as a functional founder. You say, listen, that's the boundary. And if we can't win, there's going to be a lose-lose. For you lose and we lose. And we're okay with that. And I'm sure you will be okay with that. And I think framing it that way has been very favorable to our company going forward. So in summary, I believe that we need to be grounded and clear and positive, but also draw the boundary when we need to with our employees. There are certain areas that functional founders cannot delegate, cannot build systems around. And that is having those tough conversations. In fact, I can guarantee there are some areas in your business, maybe in your life, that you are not addressing, that probably building up. It's getting bigger. The problem's just adding on. It's almost like you're carrying a suitcase on your shoulder, and the next minute, there's someone else is dumping another suitcase on your shoulder. And then you've got all this baggage. And eventually, by not addressing it, it ends up biting you. It might even not be an employee. It might be something radically different. But a functional founder addresses these issues. This is the time in our lives this year to really address those problems and make sure that they don't bite us. Functional founders, if you enjoyed this podcast, please do me a favor, share it with other functional founders. At least push the like button or subscribe. We love to hear your comments below, and I respond to every single comment and look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you for joining the Functional Founder. This podcast grows through you, our founder community. Please share this with someone who needs it and click on the subscribe button. That way, more people can join us.